Hi, I'm Wade Roush and I'm an editor at Xconomy. I want to start this video about storytelling by introducing you to two of my biggest heroes. The first is Carl Sagan, the Cornell astronomer and author and television personality who was probably the most famous scientist of his time thanks to his TV show Cosmos and his frequent appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Carl Sagan died in 1994, but I was lucky enough to meet him in person about 9 years before that, in 1985. That's a story I'll come back to in a few minutes. My other hero is Leonardo da Vinci, who was probably the most famous artist in 15th century Italy, at least until Michelangelo came along, and who was also the leading scientist of his age, depending on how you define science. Unfortunately, I was not lucky enough to meet Leonardo before he died in 1519, although that's a favorite fantasy of mine. Now, it's always hazardous to try to rank people on some kind of genius scale, but I think it's interesting to compare these two guys for a minute. Leonardo is an unparalleled figure in history in terms of his skill with a pencil or a paintbrush and his powers of observation or insight. But if you had to say which one of these two was more successful at what he set out to do in life, I think you'd have to pick Carl Sagan. Now, why do I say that? It's because both of these guys wanted to communicate their insights. Both of them wanted to chronicle the wonders they perceived in nature and share those wonders with other people. But only Sagan really succeeded at this, and he succeeded in a huge way. His science documentary series Cosmos was the most watched show in the history of PBS up to that time. And that's to say nothing of Sagan's books, including his novel Contact, which was made into a successful movie, and his contributions to the Pioneer and Voyager space probes, and to the Viking lander on Mars. So by contrast, what does Leonardo have to show for his life's work? Only about 20 surviving paintings and several thousand extremely disorganized pages of notes and sketches. I've seen some of these notes up close, and I can tell you that while they are absolutely awe-inspiring, they're also an absolute mess. Leonardo said he intended to pull his notes together into books on subjects such as painting and anatomy, but he never actually published anything, unless you count the illustrations he did for a book on geometry by his friend Luca Pacioli. It wasn't until the 19th century, when scholars began to make a careful study of Leonardo's notebooks, that he was even recognized as an inventor and a proto-scientist. Before that, he'd been seen mainly as a brilliant painter. So what accounts for the difference between Leonardo and Carl Sagan? If I had to boil it down, I'd say that Sagan had a mastery of the technology of storytelling, and Leonardo did not. Obviously, the communications technologies available to Sagan were vastly different from those of Leonardo's world, and who knows, if there had been a Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in the 1490s, Leonardo might have been a frequent guest. But if you look at the technologies that were available to Leonardo, including the printing press, you have to conclude that either he wasn't that interested in publishing his findings, or he just couldn't get his act together. And we're all a little poorer because of that. I've often wondered how history might have been different if there had been an easier way for Leonardo to share his manuscripts in real time with his contemporaries. Imagine if you traveled back in time and you gave Leonardo an iPad and you connected it via some kind of proto-internet with the iPads of contemporaries like Copernicus and Martin Luther and Niccolo Machiavelli. If they'd been able to put their heads together, we might have been able to skip over whole centuries of religious strife and scientific ignorance. That brings me to the real subject of this presentation, which is not Leonardo da Vinci or Carl Sagan, but rather the technology of storytelling. I think it's a very exciting time to be alive for many reasons, but one is that more and more people are gaining access to tools for assembling and publishing great stories. And those tools are so easy to use that almost anyone can take advantage of them, even people as chronically disorganized as Leonardo. As a result, more people are telling their stories. As a journalist, I'm a storyteller at heart myself, and one of the big themes that I love to write about is how styles of storytelling change as technology changes. When I use the word storytelling, I have a really broad and inclusive definition in mind. I'm talking about everything from sharing stories around the campfire to sharing 140 characters on Twitter. You can tell a story through words or pictures, or through moving images, or dance, or graphic design, or even the equations of physics. At the most basic level, telling stories is the way we make sense of our lives and the world around us. And it's the fact that there are so many new ways to tell stories that excites me. So part of what I'm going to do in this video is tell you a bit about my own storytelling genes and how they began to express themselves, and how I wound up in this unusual situation of being a storyteller telling stories about how stories are made. And then I'll walk you through some of the modern storytelling technologies that I'm most excited about, and show you examples of some people who are using them in very interesting ways. I was born in 1967 in Lansing, Michigan, and I grew up in a small town south of Lansing called Charlotte. My grandfather and my father ran a business together selling office machines and office supplies, and my mom worked as a public school teacher in a neighboring town. Now, I've always wished that I had been born perhaps a couple of years earlier, because then I might have been old enough to watch the Apollo missions on TV and see people walking on the moon. As it turns out, I have absolutely no memories of watching the Apollo missions, but I do remember Skylab, which helped make me into a huge space buff as a kid. And probably my earliest memory of being a storyteller was being in the 4th grade and making a big wall poster as part of a science lesson about the Saturn V rocket. My teacher showed that poster to one of the 5th grade teachers next door, and they wound up hanging it on the wall in the 5th grade classroom. I remember being incredibly thrilled about that. I think it was the first time I ever got a taste of what it's like to package up a story and have other people see it. From there, I became more and more interested in space and astronomy, and by the time I was 12 or 13, if you had asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I probably would have said astronomer. And that is partly because of Carl Sagan's show Cosmos, which came out in 1980. Now, that was a huge turning point in my life. Cosmos consisted of 13 one-hour episodes covering the whole history of the universe. It cost roughly $8 million to make, which is almost as much as George Lucas's budget for Star Wars, and it was the biggest science documentary ever to hit television. I absolutely ate it up. At Christmas in 1980, my parents gave me the companion book to the TV series, which they inscribed inside the front cover, "The Sky is the Limit." I have a very fond memory of being homesick for a few days in early 1981 and reading the book from cover to cover and being totally engrossed. In fact, it's even possible that I faked some cold symptoms in order to stay home reading. Now, there's something interesting about Cosmos. There's plenty of science in it, but it's presented in a highly untraditional way. There can hardly be less resemblance to a traditional textbook or classroom science lecture. From the very first episode, Sagan frames the science in history. There are lots of side trips to places where science was born, like the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, or Kepler's laboratory, where he fiddled with models of the Pythagorean solids, trying to work out the orbits of the planets. Cosmos is really about the history of science. It's the story of how humans figured out that the Earth is a tiny blue dot in a cosmic ocean, and that life is incredibly rare and special. I think Sagan genuinely wanted to teach his audience something about where the stars and the planets came from, but even more, I think he wanted to show them how science itself emerged as a way of thinking, and how we're immersed even today in this long human adventure of studying the universe and trying to figure it out. And Sagan was so good at this that he planted the seeds of confusion in my mind. In a lot of ways, I'd say the next 10 years of my life, as I moved through high school and college and grad school, were about sort of recognizing that confusion and dealing with it. The confusion was this: I thought Carl Sagan was an amazing guy, and I wanted to do what he did. I thought that since he was a planetary scientist who taught at Cornell, I would have to study math and physics and get a graduate degree and become an astronomer and find a job at a university somewhere. It wasn't until much later that I realized that Sagan also happened to be really good at something else, namely being a showman. If I had been better at reading the signs in my own life, I would have realized that the storytelling part was what really excited me, much more than actually doing the science. Let me explain using a couple more examples from my youth. In 1984, when I was in 11th grade, I was taking my high school's advanced physics and advanced biology courses, and for each one I needed to do an end-of-year project. My physics teacher was named Larry Cartwright, and for my project in Mr. Cartwright's class, I decided to study sunspot activity and try to relate it back to the weather here on Earth. So I built an attachment for my telescope that projected an image of the sun onto a chart, and then every day I went outside and sketched the position of the sunspots. Later, I got some local weather data and tried to see if there were any correlations between the number of sunspots that I could see and the local temperature and rainfall. At the same time, I was doing a different experiment for my biology teacher, Glenwood McNeil. I had read that it was possible that trees had a way of communicating with each other chemically, so that if one tree came under attack by pests such as gypsy moths, other nearby trees could defend themselves by making more chemicals that would make their leaves taste bitter. I wanted to test that, so I grew a bunch of maple saplings. The experiment was to start tearing the leaves of some of the saplings, as if I were a gypsy moth, and then measuring the tannic acid levels of the undamaged saplings in the same enclosure. I also measured the levels of tannic acid in a control group of saplings in a separate enclosure. Well, with both the sunspot study and the plant communication study, I got some positive results. The next step was to get my grandfather, who was a freelance photographer, to help me build some displays showing those results. We took pictures of the telescope and the maple saplings, and we mounted them on beautiful matte paper and arranged the whole thing on these pegboard display stands with beautiful plexiglass signs. I entered the projects in the annual science fair sponsored by the local newspaper, the Lansing State Journal. In the end, Those two projects won the grand prizes in the physical sciences and biological sciences categories. And I suspect today that winning those prizes had less to do with the science than with the aesthetics. Those displays that my grandfather and I made were just beautiful. Really, they would bring a tear to your eye. I think the lesson I was starting to learn was this: never underestimate the power of presentation. Now, fast forward a year or two. It's September of 1985, and I'm a freshman at Harvard College, and I'm signed up for the math and physics courses that I think I'll need if I want to be the next Carl Sagan. And in the course of one fateful week, two things happened that changed my life and pointed me toward being a professional storyteller. One was that I decided to try out for the weekly campus newspaper, the Harvard Independent. Now, if you wanted to try out for the paper, you had to pick a section, meaning news, features, sports, or arts. I was interested in news, and the first assignment naturally was to go out and find a news story. But I had no idea how to dig one up. As it turned out, though, I had one dumped in my lab, because guess who came to campus that weekend? Carl Sagan. So the story is, there was a physics professor and radio astronomer at Harvard named Paul Horowitz who was very interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Horowitz had built a computer capable of processing radio signals from space on 1 million channels simultaneously. And he had gotten permission from Harvard to hook his computer up to one of their old radio telescopes out in western Massachusetts. To do all that, he had raised some money from Steven Spielberg and from Carl Sagan's Planetary Society. So Sagan and Spielberg were in town that weekend in September for a symposium to commemorate the kickoff of the project. I attended the symposium, and after it was over, I went up to Dr. Sagan, introduced myself, and told him I was his biggest fan. He was very pleasant, and he shook my hand and said he was glad to hear it. That was really all that happened, but I'll never forget it. And it hit me later that day that that was my news story. So I wrote it up and handed it in, and on Thursday, October 3rd, 1985, I had my first story printed in the Independent. Actually, it was my first story printed anywhere. I finished trying out for the Independent, and eventually I became an assistant news editor, and over the next couple of years I worked my way up to editor-in-chief. And to make a long story short, I eventually figured out that I was more interested in writing and storytelling than in trying to be a scientist. I gave up on physics and astronomy, and I switched my major to the history of science. And I decided that I'd use that training to become a science and technology journalist. After college, I went down the street to MIT to get a doctorate in the history of technology, and I started to write for some magazines such as MIT's Technology Review and later Science Magazine. And then through a series of connections, I eventually ended up as an editor at Xconomy, covering startups and high-tech innovation in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that brings me to part 2 of this talk. Now, by giving you all these autobiographical details, I haven't been trying to bore you. I've been trying to build up a stockpile of stories that I can draw on in the second part of the talk to drive home my real point, which is that the art of storytelling evolves as technology evolves. One of the great pleasures of my job is that I get to try out lots of new technologies, whether because I'm writing about them or because I want to use them to tell my own stories. But probably the biggest news about storytelling right now is that you don't have to be a journalist to do it. There's a quote attributed to the great journalist A.J. Liebling. It says, "Freedom of the press belongs to the man who owns one." Well, that might have been true once, but today what we used to think of as the power of the press belongs to almost everyone. That means the world is a lot noisier than it used to be, but it's a very encouraging thing for anyone who cares about the state of education or democracy. In a very real sense, the kid today who decides Carl Sagan is his hero doesn't have to wait 10 or 20 years before he gets a chance to create some of his own stories. He can do it instantly on his laptop or his video cam or his smartphone. To take a closer look at the evolution of storytelling, let's go back all the way to Leonardo. We don't think of Leonardo as a storyteller in the classic sense, but if you look closely at his notebooks and his art, you start to realize that he was actually telling stories all the time. In fact, he was a master at capturing an entire story in one frozen glance. For an example, let's look at the Mona Lisa. Now, this is unquestionably the world's most famous painting, and I'm sure you've seen it 1,000 times. But have you ever really looked at it? Because if you had, you'd see that there's almost a second portrait here, and that Leonardo was telling a whole story about geology and the way the landscape changes. Leonardo had spent decades observing rivers and the flow of water and how it erodes mountains and carries sediment downstream and reshapes the land, and all of that is illustrated here. Because Leonardo wasn't content just to paint a portrait, he actually had to make the background into a hydrology lesson. If you look at Leonardo's notebooks, you see that he was recording stories all the time. This is a page from the Codex on the Flight of Birds, where Leonardo was trying to reduce his observations of birds to a few simple rules that might help the pilot of a flying machine. The notes at the top of the page read, "If the wing and the tail are too much above the air current, Then you must lower half of the opposite wing to allow the wind to strike it, and you will right yourself. Which is all exactly true, and the Wright brothers and other early pilots had to learn those same tricks. As far as we know, though, Leonardo never built an actual flying machine, and he couldn't test the rules he was making up, so basically he was telling stories, just to an audience of one. I think if you kidnapped Leonardo from the 15th century and brought him to the 21st, he'd want to continue his studies, but he'd probably be saving his notebooks on Evernote and putting photos up on Instagram and sharing his latest discoveries on his Tumblr and posting links on Facebook and Twitter. And I think he would be a much more effective storyteller thanks to all those tools. In fact, you could say the same thing about Carl Sagan. If Sagan were alive today and he were just starting out with his Cosmos project, do you think he'd try to go out and raise $8 million to create a 13-hour TV series? Well, he might. And in fact, there's someone doing exactly that right now. The astronomer Neil deGrasse Tyson of the Hayden Planetarium is in many ways Sagan's modern-day heir, and he's producing a sequel to Cosmos for Fox and National Geographic. It's scheduled to air in the spring of 2014, and I'm sure it's going to be great. But you can also argue that a huge, expensive, slow-moving project like a TV series is a dinosaur these days, and that it's possible to tell stories in a much more intimate way using today's digital media. Which media? Well, if you'll allow me, I'd like to take you on a tour of the most interesting digital storytelling technologies of the past few years, and then look at examples of how ordinary people are using them. I'm going to divide these tools into 6 categories and give you 1 or 2 of my favorite examples in each category. The categories are Capture, Lifestream, Curate, Edit, Publish, and Present. Now, I've arranged these on a staircase because they get more complex as you go, and each one builds on what came before. First, Capture. You can really only be a storyteller if you have something to tell, so in a way, every story begins with an observation or an experience. I think my biology teacher, Mr. McNeil, understood this. That's why our grade in that class was mostly based on the personal notebooks we created. This is mine. It weighs about 6 pounds, and it's mostly full of pictures and diagrams that I created by hand based on books or the things we were studying in class. I think Mr. McNeil understood, just as Leonardo did, that the best way to get something into your brain is through the eyes working together with the hand. When you sit down to draw something, you really start to look at it and understand it. Now, plenty of people still like to draw on paper today, but there are also some great digital platforms for capturing notes. And my personal favorite is Evernote. There are 3 great features about Evernote that to me make it better than any paper notebook. First, it works across every computing platform, web, Mac, Windows, iPhone, iPad, Android. Second, everything you put in it, from web pages to PDFs to photos to voice memos, gets saved in the cloud so that it can then be retrieved from any of your devices. Third, it's got an excellent search feature, so even if you're as disorganized as Leonardo was, you can still search your notebooks for old notes. It even does optical character recognition on the text inside images. When you put Evernote together with a tablet device, you get a really magical combination. Not only can you create and search notes, but you can capture images from within the app and save them straight into your notebook. There is also a cool feature called the Page Camera that helps you take perfect pictures of pages from your paper notebooks and store them on Evernote. Of course, there are plenty of other great tools for capturing observations and thoughts. One that I think is extremely elegant is the Paper app from New York City startup 53, which is awesome for drawing and sketching and even doing some basic painting. And in a very different category, there's 123D Catch, an amazing app from Autodesk that builds 3D computer models of everyday objects based on your pictures of those objects. You just take 20 or 30 photos from different angles, and the program finds the common features and uses some math and pattern recognition to assemble them into a 3D scene. How does that qualify as storytelling? Well, some people are already using this app to build computer models that they can then import into music videos or their own video games. Let's move on to the second category, Lifestream. This term Lifestream was invented by academics in the 1990s for the concept of keeping a public electronic diary of your life. But it wasn't really until the beginning of the social media era that millions of people began to do this. And clearly the most successful live streaming system ever is Facebook, which is compelling because it's a gigantic, never-ending collection of shared moments and thoughts and discoveries. And over the years, as Facebook has evolved, the live streaming aspects have become more and more obvious, culminating with the timeline layout introduced in 2011. If you're a really serious user of Timeline, you can go back and fill it in with photos and other posts going all the way back to the year of your birth. Twitter, of course, is another interesting live streaming app, which started out as a medium for random insights and debates, but has evolved into something much more interesting. It's kind of a crowdsourced news network and communications fabric. I want to mention one other live streaming app because it happens to be one of my personal favorites, and it's Path. Path is similar to Facebook, but there's one huge difference, which is that you can have a maximum of 150 friends. And most people on Path have far fewer. I have about 30 friends on Path right now, and because I actually know them, I share things on Path that I would never post on Facebook. Now, a lot of people today never move up the storytelling ladder to curate, edit, publish, or present because I think they think those tasks seem too difficult. The point I want to make is that these other forms of storytelling are becoming far more accessible and far more rewarding to use. Let's start with Curate. This is where you take the stuff that you or your friends have captured and live streamed and you collect it or represent it in ways that add some kind of value. One great example of a curation tool is Storify. This is a web service that lets you assemble tweets and other social media posts into a timeline, which you can then republish elsewhere. I think Storify is brilliant because it starts with this vast fire hose of data in the form of the millions of thoughts that get posted to the live streaming networks every day, and lets you distill them down into just the right posts for summarizing an event or telling a story. Another cool example of curation is Pinterest, where people pin pictures of everything from food to clothing to art projects. You can easily spend hours scrolling through other people's pin boards. I think Pinterest succeeds as a storytelling medium for two simple reasons. First, it's extremely visual, and it offers a never-ending flow of pictures arranged in an appealing way. Second, it's just so easy to create a board and add pins to it. So at a basic level, Pinterest lets people express themselves with very little friction, simply by showing their friends what they think is cool, and that's what curation is all about. The next level of storytelling is edit. This stage starts to involve some more sophisticated tools and technologies that you need to learn if you want to take the ideas or content that you've captured in the earlier stages and transform them in a thoughtful way. The one editing tool that we've all been familiar with for decades now is the word processor, and the touchstone here is Microsoft Word. But the great thing about the digital revolution is that it allows us to go way beyond text and play with other media such as still images, audio, and video. For image editing, for example, you used to need complex and expensive tools like Adobe Photoshop. But these days, thanks to the rise of the smartphone, there are oodles of free or nearly free photo apps like iPhoto, Snapseed, and PhotoForge. Beyond photography, there's sound editing, which is getting much easier thanks to desktop programs like Audacity and Ableton Live and Hindenburg Journalist. These days, you don't have to be an audio engineer or have spent any time in the radio business to make your own podcasts. And thanks to platforms like SoundCloud, you can easily share your audio creations with the world. And then there's video editing, where there's been a true revolution. It wasn't so long ago that editing digital video required a multi-million-dollar editing suite. Now you can make decent videos on your iPhone or iPad using a $15 app like iMovie. If you want to get a little more advanced, you can use Final Cut Pro 10, which costs $300 and has way more bells and whistles than iMovie, but is still easy enough to learn that you don't have to be professional to use it. And if you don't want to edit your own video, there are automated tools like Animoto and Quickie and Miagraph that will take the materials you select and assemble them automatically into nice videos with music and animation. Now, if you're going to the trouble of editing something, you probably have plans to take it to the next level, which is publish, which means taking your creations and putting them online where millions of people can access them. The turning point for publishing technology came back in the 1990s with the invention of Blogger, which was the first real blogging platform that anybody could use. Blogger is still around today as part of Google, but there are also far more powerful blogging tools like Tumblr and Squarespace and WordPress. If you're more into books than blogs, there are services like Vook or Blurb or Inkling or iBooks Author that make it easy to create your own ebooks. And these days, it's pretty easy to include sound and animation and video inside an ebook. Now, in the video world, something truly amazing is happening thanks to the convergence of three trends. First is the fact that video capture is so cheap and easy. You can get a great HD video camera these days for under $400. And even our smartphones have HD video and recording baked in. Second is the invention of easy-to-use video editing tools like iMovie and Final Cut Pro. Third is the emergence of a business and technical infrastructure for digital video publishing in the form of YouTube. As a result, there's a new galaxy of video personalities who are each famous to perhaps only a few million people. There's a lot of really fun video out there. Two of my favorites are Minute Physics, where a guy named Henry Reich uses a whiteboard and stop-motion animation to make cosmology and particle physics fun. And then there's Vi Hart, who works for Khan Academy and makes amazing videos about math and geometry. For a lot of people, the only thing more scary than performing on video is talking to an audience in person, which brings me to the final category of storytelling tools, present. In this category, there are some old software tools like Microsoft's PowerPoint and Apple's Keynote But in a way, those programs are just computerized versions of the Magic Lantern, which was basically the slide projector of the 1820s. Lately, some smaller players have been moving into this space and getting people to rethink what it means to give a presentation. There are companies like Haiku Deck that are building touchscreen-enabled tools for creating attractive slide decks. And then there are companies like Prezi that allow you to arrange and move between your visual materials in completely new ways. If you hadn't guessed already, I made this presentation using Prezi. And at Prezi, this is what they call the big reveal. Now, what I'm trying to argue here is that in every single category, from capture, Lifestream, and Curate to edit, publish, and present, there are exciting new technologies out there that make it easier for professionals and non-professionals alike to tell their own stories. Before I close, I want to show you just a few more of my favorite examples of people actually doing this. One fun example is the whole genre of Star Trek fan films. The best example is probably Star Trek Phase 2, which is a non-profit operation staffed entirely by volunteers who are simply passionate about the Star Trek universe. There have been about 10 episodes of Star Trek Phase 2 so far, and they're all filmed on sets in an abandoned car dealership in Port Henry, New York. They're edited in Final Cut Pro and published on the web, and the special effects turn out way better than the ones on the original series in the 1960s. Moving to a completely different genre, and one that's a little closer to my own heart, I wanted to mention an experimental publishing startup called Matter. It's based in San Francisco, and the idea is to provide an outlet for long-form stories about science and technology, written by freelance journalists. There's one new story each month, and for 99 cents you can download it to your web browser or your ebook reader. What's interesting to me about Matter is that it's the kind of operation that would have been impossibly expensive and difficult just a few years ago, but now the technologies make it feasible. One more example of new media from the world of education. I'm sure you're aware there's a revolution going on in high schools and universities. Classrooms are being flipped inside out, and students are learning online or teaching one another. One project I've been following is going on at MIT under the coordination of my friend Graham Ramsey at the Experimental Study Group, an alternative freshman year program. The initiative is called ESGX, and it involves training students to outline, storyboard, script, shoot, edit, and publish their own educational videos. Here's an example.
Hi, my name is Stephen Fine. I'm a freshman at MIT, class of 2015, and I'm also a member of the Experimental Study Group. Today I would like to talk about the Lorentz Transformation. The Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz derived these equations, and these equations have many uses in modern-day physics. For the purposes of this video, we will derive the Lorentz transformation between two frames in relative motion along the x-axis, at constant velocity with respect to the dock. Suppose we want to determine how each observer would describe the boat's location. T equals t prime equals 0, and x prime are initially at the same location.
So the theory behind all of this is that when you try to teach something to someone else, you actually learn it yourself better than you ever could just by reading about it. I've definitely found that to be true in my own writing, and over time the MIT program could generate hundreds of videos that cover the whole range of required subjects for undergraduates at the Institute. Often in the mainstream media, you'll see the term user-generated content applied to things like fan fiction or educational YouTube videos. The term is often used in a slyly dismissive or derogatory way, as if real content isn't supposed to be made by users. I think what that represents is insecurity. The traditional commercial media and educational institutions are worried that the gap between professional and non-professional storytelling is narrowing, and that consumers' attention is being diverted by all these new options. And you know what? They are absolutely right to be worried, because their value proposition is being challenged on a fundamental level. But I'm not worried at all. In fact, I think we're entering an era of unprecedented richness in the media, because so many more people have the chance to express their visions of the world. And that's part of what I want to keep writing about as a technology journalist. I think there's going to be plenty to write about because the pace of technological change is only accelerating. Let's jump back to Leonardo one more time. The Renaissance was a time of huge upheaval, but on the other hand, the storytelling technologies that Leonardo learned when he was an apprentice in the 1470s, like pencil, pen and ink, and oil paints, were the same ones he used for the rest of his life. Today, the situation is completely different. When I was a kid, I documented my science projects using analog media like paper and markers, pegboard, and printed photographs. And when I consumed media, it was in the form of Hollywood films, broadcast television, and print books. Today, Most of those technologies are either obsolete or irrelevant, or are being dramatically disrupted. So the technology of storytelling is evolving today much faster than it ever has. Let's end where we began, with space and astronomy. I really admire Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I'm glad he's doing a remake of Cosmos. But with all due respect, I don't think Dr. Tyson is the next Carl Sagan. I think the next Carl Sagan is probably some kid who's been living and breathing the internet and mobile technology his whole life, who loves explaining science and other subjects to his fellow students, and who's so fluent in video production and YouTube and Twitter and blogging and animation that he'll be able to build up an audience of millions on a shoestring budget. And when that happens, watch out, because the old business structures for publishing and education and broadcasting could crumble. Today, everyone can be a Leonardo or a Carl Sagan. Everyone can share their knowledge and experience and passion, whether it's for cosmology or Star Trek or electronic dance music or macrame. We aren't waiting around for the establishment to educate or entertain us. We're using technology to do that for each other. I think that's incredibly exciting, and if there's anything that makes me optimistic about how we'll cope with the amazing challenges coming in the 21st century, that's it. Thanks for watching.